Welcome to my lecture on active conductances. So today we are going to review the seminal work of Hodgkin and Huxley. First we'll look at the technique they introduced, the voltage clamp technique. Then we'll see how it helps us to study voltage-dependent membrane permeability. We look at the sodium and potassium conductances, the two main players of the action potentials, and their voltage and time dependence. So the voltage clamp technique is used to study the permeability changes of membranes. The problem is that the action potential is a dynamical process and it is not simple to measure during this process. And what the voltage clamp technique does, it allows you to clamp the membrane voltage, which means you have all the time it takes to really study the currents that flow at that voltage. So you need two electrodes. That's why really it helps to use a preparation like the giant squid, where the axon is huge, because you need both electrodes in the axon. So one is the measuring electrode. So here you measure the voltage inside, and then you take the difference to a reference, which is the intracellular voltage, and then you compare that to a command voltage. And then if the command, if the current is, if the voltage is below the command, then you pass a positive current, and vice versa. If the voltage is above the command voltage, you pass a negative current in this negative feedback loop that allows you to keep the voltage constant at the value that you set here with the command voltage. And then you do this process, you measure the current, and when you have voltage, when you know the voltage, you measure the current, you can measure the conductance, which is just one divided by the other. So in the voltage clamp, the time-dependent current is measured to maintain the intracellular potential at a given value, the command voltage. So, and when you do this, in this squid axon, you have a resting potential of -65, and then you pass a command to put it to -130 millivolts. And what you see, other than a brief capacitive current, it's well known that membrane voltages, the membranes have a little capacitance, so there's a little glitch here. Actually nothing happens, there's no current flowing. However, if you now set the command voltage to 0, then you get something very surprising against the capacitive current, but then surprisingly you get a transient inward current, a negative current, and then slowly building up a delayed outward current. So during a depolarizing voltage command, both the transient inward and the delayed outward current are measured. Our convention is that negative currents are inward. Okay, you can repeat this process to many different stepping voltages from -26 to 0 to 26, 52 and 65 millivolts, and you see at -26 just this little brief inward current that is transient, and then a tiny delayed current. And as you keep increasing the voltage, this kind of inward current first increases, this transient, and then it decreases until it becomes 0 or maybe positive over here. And the transient, the steady current actually increases with the stepping voltage. When you now just plot the amplitude of this transient current and the steady amplitude of the delayed current, then you get these two curves as a function of membrane potential. You have that at below -50 millivolts, you get essentially no current, and the transient current actually starts increasing, becomes a negative inward current, and for some voltages around 50 millivolts, it becomes actually a positive current. And the late current actually is just increasing, always positive. So these are the two currents, and as we're going to see, they are subserved by two different ions. And there was a very clever experiment Hodgkin and Huxley did to study the ions, which is simply to remove the ions from the extracellular medium. So when you do this experiment again, you step into 0 millivolts, and now you measure this early inward current and this delayed outward current. Now you put the squid axon into a sodium-free environment, then actually the early inward current is outwards. When you put in back the sodium, it comes back. It's a reversible process. This clearly shows that this early inward current is sodium dependent. It is actually sodium flowing across the membrane. And not surprisingly, then the other current is potassium dependent. So when you repeat this exactly same experiment and you now not remove extracellular potassium, but you add tetrodotoxin, it's also known as TTX. It's a venom that is used by animals as defense. For example, the pufferfish uses that as a defense, or it's used by octopus to kill prey. So when you use this tetrodotoxin, then the potassium currents are blocked. The sodium currents are blocked, and you get again the same effect, that there's an inward current is blocked. But when you add tetraethylammonium, then you actually block the potassium currents, and then you can see that this delayed outward current is no longer there. So the delayed outward current is potassium dependent. It's potassium flowing across the membrane. Good, now taking these two pictures together, here's again a recapitulation of the stepping voltages. Here is the measured currents, and now we can, by either removing sodium or blocking the potassium channels, we can now look at those conductances individually. So here is the sodium conductance. It keeps increasing with a larger and larger depolarizing stepping voltage, but it's transient. And here is the potassium conductance. It also keeps increasing, and it's slowly rising but non-transient. It has a steady state. This kind of voltage dependence here, that a large negative voltage, that there is hardly any current flowing in either case, the conductances are close to zero, gives rise to these voltage dependence curves. So this is now the voltage dependence of the peak sodium conductance, shown here on the left. And on the right is the voltage dependence of the steady potassium conductance. So they are very similar, these curves. Essentially, the conductances are off. They're switched off at around minus 80 millivolts. They're starting to be turned on at minus 40 to minus 20. And they reach a steady value at about 20 to 40 millivolts. So this is the commonality between the two conductances. Their voltage dependence is very similar. It has this kind of sigmoid shaped curve. When you now estimate with all these information that we learned, we can now estimate what are actually the underlying conductances of the action potential, right? We can now trace the action potential here in voltage, in time, and we know at every voltage what we expect for the conductance to do. And when you plot this here, then we expect the sodium conductance to rise sharply, and that's the inflowing sodium that leads the voltage to depolarize close to the reversal potential of the sodium channel. And then you have, with increasing voltage, you have the conductance channel getting activated. It's a bit slower, so you have now both sodium and you have sodium rushing into the cell and potassium rushing out of the cell, which leads to a repolarization of the membrane. So you come down because more and more potassium comes in. And also this sodium channel kind of closes here. The closing is due on the one hand to the voltage dependence. We go negative again because we're going now towards the reversal potential of the potassium channel. But there's also a time dependence, as we're going to see. And there's a clear experiment that has shown the time dependence of the recovery from inactivation. So the sodium channel, it inactivates. It is active process, and it takes some time to recover. The beautiful experiment to show this kind of time dependence is when you just apply two stimuli at a variable interval. So when the interval between two pulses, current pulses that you inject into the squid axon is about 9 milliseconds, then you get an action potential in response to the first pulse and an action potential in response to the second pulse. But as you keep making these interpulse intervals smaller, then you get that the second action potential has a smaller amplitude. At around 4.5 milliseconds interval, there is hardly any action potential left. And the beauty of this is that this agrees, this measurement over here agrees with the simulations here on the right that we get just from those beautiful measurements of the voltage dependence and the time dependence of the sodium activation. So it's kind of one of the, I would say, the first revolutionary breakthrough in computational neuroscience to simulate the action potential and its shape as a function of these complex, in these complex experiments where you change the interpulse interval. And we have to really remind ourselves that this work was done essentially in the 1950s, where there were no computers really around to be used. So this was really a heroic piece of work that Hodgkin and Huxley did. Okay, we can look at this same curve in this plot. If you just look at the action potential amplitude as a function of the stimulus interval, then we see, as I said, at around 4 to 5 milliseconds, there's hardly a second action potential coming through, but then with larger intervals, the second action potential comes through. And here's again the measurement, here's again the theory, and there's a beautiful agreement between those two. I should note that this kind of recovery time of 4 milliseconds applies to the squid giant axon, but for the neurons of the vertebrate central nervous system, like the cortical neurons in mammals, for example, the recovery time is much faster, on the order of 1 millisecond. So as a rule of thumb, cortical neurons, they do not fire more than 1 kilohertz. It's impossible because of the refractoriness of the sodium channel. Good, so we have seen now the basic mechanisms, the two conductances underlying the action potential. They underlie the sodium dynamics, so we have a dynamic process that has a positive feedback loop, right? The sodium feedback loop is positive because the more the membrane depolarizes, the more sodium comes in. The more the membrane depolarizes, the more sodium comes in. So this is clearly an unstable feedback loop, and like every unstable feedback loop, it needs to be controlled. And the way nature controls it is by inactivation. It's this positive feedback loop inactivates in time, which is, of course, the required mechanism to stabilize this thing. The other feedback loop is negative, right? The more the membrane depolarizes, the more potassium rushes out of the cell, and the more this tends to repolarize the membrane, which means this is a stable feedback loop. It doesn't need to be stabilized by an additional mechanism. It's intrinsically stable because negative feedback loops are stable. Good, so this concludes what I wanted to show in this lecture. So we should have learned today what electrophysiology method is used to study membrane biophysics. And we learned in what way the action potential changes in shape when you increase the extracellular sodium concentration, right? We can think about that. We should be able to answer this question. And the question we can maybe answer by thinking carefully is what happens when you punch a small hole into a neuron, if you make when you make a damage to a neuron. We can also answer that question by thinking, and I'd be happy to discuss these questions later on. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. See you soon. Bye.